The superheated rhetoric over immigration and border security in the United States today is part of a long tradition of anti-immigration hysteria in the United States. Today's guest puts our recent panic in a sociological context, exploring changes in who works on American dairy farms and how they traveled from Latin America to farms in the upper Midwest. She's Julie Keller this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University. Alongside me is my friend and co-host, G. Wayne Miller of the Providence Journal. Story in the Public Square is an effort to study, celebrate, and tell stories that matter. To do that, we sit down every week with the best storytellers around, filmmakers, authors, scholars, and more, to make sense of the big stories that shape public life in the United States today. To help us this week, we're joined by Julie Keller, a sociologist at the University of Rhode Island whose new book explores the migrant workers in the American dairy industry. Julie, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much.
So the book is Milking in the Shadows, Migrants and Mobility in America's Dairyland. This is sort of a really interesting focus on the whole immigrant labor question, because you're looking at well, tell us who you're looking at. I'll let you tell the story.
Sure. So I'm really interested in this new labor system that developed in Wisconsin, late 90s to early 2000s. You began to see, instead of relying on local white European Americans to do the tough work of milking cows, we began to see more and more immigrants taking on these jobs. So I was really interested in how this new labor system developed. How is it that farmers began hiring some of these workers? Where are they coming from? What is life like once they get there? What are their hopes, their dreams, and their struggles?
Well, let's take this sort of step by step. What triggered that change in the labor supply?
So a few different factors. One is that farmers were absolutely experiencing this pressure to expand and expand in the late 90s. In order to be profitable as an operation, they really had to be milking more cows, putting in more hours, and that really necessitated more people to hire in order to get that work done. So there was this pressure to expand. Looking around their rural community, they didn't exactly see the kind of reliable help that they were looking for, and that caused them to turn to other sources.
And by other sources, where did they wind up turning?
Eventually, they did turn to Latin American immigrants, mostly coming from Mexico.
So what was the genesis of the book? How did you get interested in this? I mean, as a sociologist, there are many topics you could have covered. Do you have roots in Wisconsin, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm from California, and I was born and raised in Fresno. So Fresno County is the #1 agricultural county in the nation, actually. In terms of economic productivity, it's an incredibly rich place for agriculture. But I was raised in the suburbs, actually. So I had never, been on a farm. I didn't have that kind of farm experience. But my grandmother, as it turns out, she was raised on a farm, and she was actually born in Wisconsin, spent a lot of her childhood on a Wisconsin farm. Eventually her family moved to Oregon, and then her family spent time farming in Oregon. So I used to sit at her feet and listen as a child to the stories that she would tell me of life growing up on a farm, drinking milk straight from the cow, picking blueberries, playing in the bales of hay and so forth.
It's sort of it's a Norman Rockwell-esque existence that you're describing.
Right, absolutely. And I was in awe of that, being a kid in the suburbs. It really, really fascinated me. So fast forward, years later, I'm in graduate school. I'm very interested in social issues, and so I chose to enroll at the University of Wisconsin-Madison And a professor there who I started working with, Michael Bell, is interested in everything having to do with rural places. He's fascinated by rural people, rural communities, rural culture, gender in rural spaces, rural masculinity. So my interest in rural spaces and farms really began to develop when I started working with him.
So these undocumented workers who are filling a gap, for lack of a better word, in Wisconsin and other states, we'll get into that too in a minute, come mainly from Mexico. Why is it Mexico as opposed to some other part of the world?
Sure. So when another professor that I worked with at Wisconsin, she conducted a survey of these immigrant workers in Wisconsin to understand, where are they coming from? And it really was the vast majority of them were coming from Mexico. And it was really seemed to be an issue of proximity. You had 89% of immigrant workers who were coming from Mexico going all the way up to Wisconsin to work on these farms. And as far as we could tell, this happened through a process of network migration. Is one person tells another person there are opportunities in Wisconsin, and then before you know it, you have this stream of people coming all the way up to the upper Midwest to milk cows.
So when you talk about coming up, it isn't a question of getting on a train or a car or a plane and going to Wisconsin. These are undocumented workers. So the coming up is something that faces them with a lot of obstacles. Talk about that. I mean, even getting here, and then we'll talk about the conditions they endure when they do work.
Absolutely. So it's absolutely a perilous journey. The workers that I spoke with 60 different workers that I interviewed for my study, and of the 60, all of them were actually undocumented during their time in the U.S. One of them did have a tourist visa for a certain period of time, but the fact that she was working on a dairy farm was in violation of that tourist visa. So it's a long journey. There are a number of risks and barriers taking on that kind of journey. And there's no guarantee, that they will even make it across. Many of the folks I spoke with when I went down to Veracruz and spent time in villages there, many of the folks I spoke with said, I was caught at the border, I was sent back, we didn't cross, but I'm thinking of trying again soon. So it's an incredibly complex, perilous journey that's filled with all kinds of risks.
Do you have to protect the identities of the people that you interviewed, like institutional review board stuff? Because there would be some legal consequences and some other consequences for these folks if you outed them in their in their employers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I use pseudonyms throughout my book for the workers and for the farmers as well, for the people employing them as well. And I also come up with pseudonyms for the towns I visited, the names of the dairy farms, of course. I came up with pseudonyms for those as well. And establishing trust was a really big concern when I started doing this work. How am I, an American, white woman, I was a graduate student when I started this work, how am I going to establish that kind of trust with these workers in order to hear their stories and hear their struggles? And that was a difficult thing, and I had to rely on my contacts in order to make that happen. So I knew one person who's a tremendous advocate for these workers, and once I met her, that really opened up the gates. I had the amount of trust I needed in order for people to say, okay, I know Julie, I know who her friend is. I think it's okay to sit down and talk with her.
So this is a process that took a number of years. So this wasn't like an overnight. I go down to Veracruz, I talk to 3 people of 60, whatever, and boom, we're done. So what are the economic conditions in this part of Mexico that would prompt someone to even want to take this very perilous journey? And it's not just getting there, it's coming home, but what are the economic conditions?
So the villages where I stayed, where the participants in my study, where they come from, it's a context where there just aren't many jobs at all. So these are rural villages. It's actually an indigenous area. So for my participants, their first language is not Spanish. It's their indigenous language. That's their mother tongue. After that, they then learn Spanish when they enroll in schools, and then
so these are natives. No.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then imagine moving, somewhere else to a different country. Then they're learning English as well when they're moving to the U.S. So they're trilingual, really.
Do you have an idea, an estimate of the numbers of people we're talking about who would make this trip, say, every year or whatever period of time?
Every year is tough to say, but a survey that, the same survey that a professor at Wisconsin I mentioned, her name is Jill Harrison, the survey she conducted back in 2008, she estimated that there were around 5,500 immigrant dairy workers just in Wisconsin alone. Now we know that, that the pattern of migration seems to be that migrants would start off in their home village, they would make it to Wisconsin, and the goal for them was to work not just for 6 months or a year, but to actually work for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, then return back to their village and work on building a house, investing in a business, what have you. Then consider, okay, can I make another journey? Can I make it another 3 or 4 year-long trip back to Wisconsin, earn some more money?
So describe, there's so many places to go with this. I mean, it's
Yeah, no
absolutely
kidding.
fascinating work. But describe the conditions that these migrant workers find once they get to the Dairyland, once they get to Wisconsin.
Sure. So out of the 60 workers I spoke with, it was pretty typical for workers to be living on the farm property. And this was seen as an advantage for farmers and an advantage really for workers as well, because their housing was paid for by the employer. And so that's part of explaining in some ways how it is that Wisconsin came to be such a big destination for these immigrants. It's that the draw of free housing was big for them. Now, what I found, however, is that just because you have free housing, that doesn't mean that it's high quality housing. Right. So unfortunately, in a lot of the cases where I would visit workers on the farm property, they're living in a trailer, and it's definitely not a high quality living situation. I saw holes in the floor, heard mice scurrying around. Oftentimes the bathroom would be broken. But then, on the other hand, I would go to some of the housing of a couple other workers that I spoke with, and it was much better. They were actually in a house that the farmer was paying the rent on, and they were very happy with those conditions.
So what kind of work are they doing? Obviously, they're milking cows. We know that, but that's not all they're doing.
Absolutely.
What else do they do? This is hard work.
Sure, absolutely. So primarily they're milking cows, and what that consists of is taking on a number of different shifts, milking cows in a milking parlor or a milking barn. So the amount of time per shift really would depend on, well, how many workers are there, how many cows, what's the herd size. But a typical arrangement would be, a typical sort of length of working time would be, waking up in early hours of the morning and then spending, let's say, 5 hours milking cows. Now that includes the pre-milking work that you have to do to prepare the space, right? Making sure the equipment is clean, cleaning off the cows' teats before you attach the milk machines, and then after the cows are milked and after they're rotated through that milking parlor, you then have to clean everything off and make sure that it's sanitary and ready for the next time. So that could take 5 hours, 6 hours. It could take less depending on the herd size, number of people working. So then you would have another shift in addition. That's just because you have one shift, that doesn't mean that's it for the day, but often you'd have 2 shifts one day, and then the next day you'd have 1 shift and then back to 2 shifts.
Help me understand the economics of this. So up until the late 90s, early noughts, this was largely done by family members, by local employees. Why did they stop?
So it's a big question, and I think the answer is complicated. Why are there fewer young people interested in farming today? Why is it that we don't see a lot of young people clamoring to live in the countryside? Farmers will tell you, or at least they told me, that locals started to have different expectations for what work looked like. They were more interested in having a job where they're inside in a comfortable environment. They're not exposed to the dirt, to the manure, to the smell, right? And moreover, they wanted higher pay than farmers are able and willing to provide.
So there are two sort of related questions in my mind. Then is it safe? Is it an overstatement to say that these are jobs that American citizens don't want to do? And then the related question is there an economic benefit to the local farmers to use undocumented migrant labor rather than paying more and finding other people who might be willing to do the job who are here legally?
It's a tough question. I mean, what I heard from farmers is that they couldn't find reliable local help. But I always like to push back on that a little bit. You know, well, what does reliable actually mean to you?
Right.
And come to find it usually means someone who's willing to be paid very little, right? Just above the minimum wage, which in Wisconsin is $7.25. And putting in such hard hours for real and no benefits besides free housing. That's a big one, obviously.
Yeah.
But you don't you don't have a guaranteed day off. You don't have health care. You don't get sick time, and so forth. So, you know, that's part of it. I think is pushing back on that. Well, this reliability question. But the other part is surely if you have a group of people who are vulnerable, right? They are. There's a high chance of them being exploited, right? So it's much easier to pay that group less because they're less likely to stand up and push back and insist on a higher pay.
So let's say you work for a year on a farm. How much would you save and then send back or bring back to your home country of Mexico?
Thousands. I mean, you could save thousands, especially with not having to pay for housing. And so workers would save up as much as they could, sending their remittances back to Mexico, to their families, to keep safe for them. And then once they felt as though they had sent back enough money to really make a start back home in Mexico, they would think about making that return journey back home. And then the first thing usually was working on building a house for themselves, building a house out of concrete, something durable, something that would be around for a while, that would be something that they could hand down to their kids.
Wouldn't these undocumented workers live in fear of ICE showing up at the farm one morning, and we know what happens then?
Absolutely, absolutely.
I mean, there's an anxiety and psychological component here that seems considerable to me.
Absolutely. So this was a big concern for the workers I spoke with is anytime they're leaving the farm property, you've got this cloud of anxiety, right? Of, well, any kind of contact I have with police could open the pathway to eventual deportation. So that was something that workers talked to me about. And this was a fear that just permeated their very movement. And that's my focus on mobility, is everyday movement, is that fear that's really part of their life, stopping them from leading their life, going to get groceries, going to the doctor, all of these sorts of things that you and I take for granted.
So you're essentially a prisoner. I mean, this isn't like you put in a long week and you make some money, and then on Friday night you go to the local watering hole and see your friends and dance and listen to music.
It's very different. At least the workers I spoke with, many of them talked about that isolation, that it was just very difficult for them to feel truly comfortable. And I could see the difference because when I was in the villages in Mexico, I would walk around past the central square, and there's so much social activity. People standing on the corner, chatting with each other, going to the bakery, chatting.
It's a real community.
Absolutely, that communal feel. And I would ask workers, well, what is it like in Wisconsin compared to back home? And they would say it's just really different. We just don't go out, they would say.
And the flip side of that, or the very related side of that, is the families back in Mexico. Their loved one, father, mother, whatever it is in Wisconsin, could be grabbed, could never come back. I mean, that has to have a toll of some kind psychologically on the family. Did you talk to the folks in Mexico about that?
I did speak with some family members, and I remember speaking with one mother in particular, and she has 5 sons, all of whom at some point made their way to Wisconsin to work on dairy farms. And she just told me about her faith in God. She talked to me extensively about how much she prays, to get word from her sons, to hear that they had made it across the border safely, and then waiting for them to contact her, telling her, okay, I made it to Wisconsin safely. It's very, very difficult. And in fact, when I spoke with mothers and wives, they told me that the passage of time works differently for them. It's very slow because they're waiting and waiting to make sure that their loved one has has crossed successfully.
So, I don't, this is a fascinating conversation, and I don't want to ruin it by talking about politics, but it seems like the elephant in the room is the recent debate that we've had about border security and undocumented immigrants. How does this manifest itself? My stepson is obsessed with electoral maps. And so I remember Wisconsin in 2016, and all of those rural counties where I'm assuming these dairy farms are were very red. How does this manifest itself in Wisconsin politics?
It's quite complex, and I was watching that map too that night. I absolutely remember watching those counties and thinking, wow, I've been to these places, and
these farmers are dependent upon this labor.
Right. How?
I mean, they know who
could
they're
this
employing.
happen?
It isn't like they wake up
Absolutely.
one day and they go, oh, you came from
Right.
Mexico? Oh, wish you told me.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And there are two things here. There's the fact that you could be a farmer and these are your workers, and down the road, your neighbor who's not a farmer may have a very different outlook on this situation, right? So I had farmers tell me that their neighbors, they know their neighbors are voting a certain way, and they felt as though their neighbors weren't totally aware of just how important this labor was. Now, on the flip side, you had farmers who absolutely did vote for Trump, right? And as far as I can tell from the media accounts there that I've read, the newspaper accounts there, it seems as though they were hoping that this wouldn't mean that their workers would be deported.
Wow. That's
right.
sort of, that's striking. It's yeah.
It is striking, that is the word. There are undocumented workers in the dairy industry in other states too, though. Is that not true? I mean, you focus on Wisconsin for all of the obvious reasons, but what are some of the other states? California, is there a situation parallel there?
Absolutely. So I come from California. California is the #1 dairy state now. It's surpassed Wisconsin in terms of overall milk production. Wisconsin's still #1 for cheese, though, which I've got to put in there, right? I got the cheese heads, right?
No, I'm glad you did, because
right?
you kept all your friends back there.
Right, exactly. But we see a similar situation when we look at other top dairy states. California, New York State, right? Coming right up and increasing in production in recent years with their Greek yogurts, right? Where is Chobani located? In the state of New York. So you're seeing some of these same issues around workers' rights and working conditions across different dairy states. And in Vermont as well, you're seeing a lot of activists coming together to advocate for the rights of immigrant dairy workers. In Vermont, there's been some incredible developments around this, where Ben & Jerry's has, in the last 2 years, finally they agreed, after some pushing, to just source their milk from farms that were paying a fair wage to their employees, and that were offering quality housing, and that were offering health insurance, and that were offering workers education workshops to educate workers about how to stand up for your rights.
So I can eat my Cherry Garcia now without guilt. Without That's good. I don't mean to make light of it. Obviously, that's a really good development. Are there other states beyond what you just mentioned? New York, Vermont, California?
Idaho as well.
Idaho
is a top dairy state as well, and there are increasing efforts to protect workers there as well. The tough part is, networking workers together. I mean, you're talking about rural places. It's very difficult to get around when you're in a rural space, and depending on the state, undocumented immigrants may or may not be able to have a driver's license. In Wisconsin, they cannot get a driver's license if they're undocumented. So that's another layer.
Are you still in touch with any of the people that were subject of your book? Are they? What do they make about sort of the recent politics in the United States around building a wall and increased enforcement and the separation of families? What have you heard from people who have lived this life?
So I have been in touch with a handful of the workers from my initial study. And when I went back to the villages in January 2017, so that was after the election but before the inauguration, And workers had a lot of questions for me. What is he going to do, meaning Trump? Is he actually going to follow through on these promises? I said, I have no idea. Your guess is as good as mine. We didn't know a lot then, but I could feel the anxiety and I could feel the fear.
Do you think that anxiety is this? So there's a school of thought out there that says that some of the increased immigration over America's southern border right now is driven by this fear that it's actually going to get worse. That if you're going to come to the United States, you've got to come now, before they build the wall, before they do all these other things. Because once the door is shut, you're not going to get in. Is there any validity to that?
I hear the same thing as you do through media reports. I'm just not certain exactly what's driving flows right now. But I do know that the economy is a big one, and in fact, we are not at the highest point of immigration flows, not at all, right?
In fact, we're at historic lows.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Right? And so if you see that data over time, you recognize that, and so the fact that we have this, this supposed crisis, it's very interesting.
Did putting a human face on this issue help in terms of the storytelling, getting this across? I mean, your book is obviously full of a lot of facts and figures, but it's also full of people. Was that deliberate? I mean, you're telling their stories.
In about 30 seconds.
Absolutely. I would encourage workers when I sat down with them. I'm not going to just give you yes or no questions here, right? Is elaborate, please. Tell me a story. Tell me the last time you left the farm. What was it like? Tell me a story about when you first got to Wisconsin. How did you feel? I really wanted to get that kind of story from my participants to put it in the book, and I just hope that I'm doing them justice by publishing the book and getting it out there.
It is a remarkable book, and we thank you so much for sharing it with us. She's Julie Keller. The book is Milking in the Shadows, Migrants and Mobility in America's Dairyland. That's all the time we have this week, but if you want to know more about Story in the Public Square, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter or visit pellcenter.org, where you can always catch previous episodes. He's Wayne, I'm Jim, hoping you'll join us next time for more Story in the Public Square.